Drones were supposed to make the world smaller. A pilot could send a small machine into the sky and see things no human eye could easily reach. The tops of cliffs, the insides of collapsed buildings, the empty stretches of land where no road leads. Most of the time, what a drone captures is beautiful. Rivers winding through valleys. Forests stretching to the horizon. But every so often, a routine flight turns into something nobody expected, something that makes the pilot's hands shake on the controller. Today, we're looking at several unsettling discoveries drone operators have stumbled into by accident, and we're saving the strangest one, the one from the river bank, for last. A hobbyist pilot in the Pacific Northwest was testing a new drone's battery life by flying it along a stretch of forest he'd walked 100 times. He wanted long, uneventful footage, something to check for signal drops and camera stability. Instead, about 15 minutes into the flight, the drone passed over a small clearing he didn't remember being there before. A tent sat pitched at an angle. One side collapsed as though something had pulled it down from the inside. A camp chair lay tipped over nearby, and scattered around it were the kinds of items you'd expect from a weekend trip. A cooler with its lid propped open, a lantern still hanging from a low branch. What unsettled him wasn't the mess. It was the silence. No people. No cars nearby. No trail leading in or out that looked recently used. He circled the drone twice, low enough to get a clear look, but never saw a single sign of the campers themselves. He reported the sighting to local rangers, who later confirmed the site had been abandoned for what appeared to be several months, though no missing persons report matched the location. To this day, nobody knows why the camp was left exactly as it was mid-use, with nobody ever coming back for it. In a frozen lake in the upper Midwest, a drone pilot mapping ice thickness for a local fishing club noticed something strange in the thermal footage. Beneath several feet of solid ice, a rectangular shape held a slightly different temperature signature than the water around it, subtle but consistent, running in a straight line for nearly 40 feet. Straight lines don't occur naturally in a lake bed. The pilot flew back and forth over the anomaly for almost 20 minutes, adjusting the thermal sensitivity each time, hoping the shape would reveal itself as a sunken dock or an old boat. Instead, the outline stayed sharp and geometric, like the roofline of a small building. Local historical records mentioned an old ice fishing shelter that had reportedly sunk decades earlier during a spring thaw, but nobody could confirm whether the shape matched. When divers were eventually sent to examine the area in warmer months, the visibility was too poor to get conclusive footage, and the structure, whatever it was, remains unexplained beneath the surface to this day. A drone operator filming a documentary about wildlife migration patterns in a remote mountain range captured something that still circulates online today. While tracking a herd of elk moving along a ridge line at dusk, the drone's camera briefly panned across a rock formation above the animals. For less than 2 seconds, a tall, upright shape was visible standing motionless near the tree line, seemingly watching the herd below. The pilot didn't notice it in real time. He only saw it later while reviewing the footage frame by frame. By the time he sent the drone back to the same coordinates, whatever had been standing there was gone, and no tracks or evidence were found on a follow-up hike days later. Wildlife biologists who reviewed the footage suggested it may have simply been a large bear standing upright, a known but uncommon behavior. Still, something about the stillness of the shape, and the way it appeared to be facing directly toward the camera despite the drone's distance and altitude, left the pilot uneasy enough that he stopped flying that route entirely. Not every unsettling drone discovery is visual. One pilot in a coastal town was using his drone's onboard microphone to record ambient ocean sounds for a relaxation video. Reviewing the audio later, he noticed a faint, rhythmic tapping sound buried beneath the waves and wind, occurring roughly every 4 seconds for almost the entire 11-minute flight. The tapping didn't match any boat traffic in the area, and there were no structures nearby that could explain a mechanical noise. He flew the same route again the following week, this time watching the live video feed closely the entire time, and the sound was there again, steady, patient, coming from somewhere along the shoreline he could never quite pinpoint. He eventually chalked it up to some kind of buoy or underwater cable marker, but admitted in an online post that he never actually found the source and stopped flying that stretch of coast after dark. All of those stories are strange in their own way, but nothing compares to what happened to a pilot named Daniel, flying a drone along a quiet stretch of river outside a small rural town, in what was supposed to be a simple test flight for a new camera rig he'd just purchased. Daniel had flown drones for years, mostly for landscape photography, and he knew this particular river better than almost anyone. He'd fished it as a kid, walked its banks 100 times, and knew every bend and sandbar along its length. That familiarity is exactly why what he saw that afternoon didn't make sense to him at first. He launched the drone from a gravel pull-off near the road, planning a slow, low pass along the water to test the new camera's stabilization in windy conditions.
The day
Was overcast, the water running high and brown from recent rain, and for the first several minutes, the flight was exactly as uneventful as he expected.
trees.
Water. The occasional heron lifting off from the shallows. Then, as the drone rounded a bend where the bank curved sharply inward, Daniel noticed something pale against the dark mud, half covered by a tangle of driftwood that had washed up during the recent flooding. At first, he assumed it was trash, a stretch of white tarp or an old appliance that had been swept downstream. He nudged the drone lower and slowed its forward speed, framing the object in the center of the camera feed. But the closer the drone got, the less it looked like debris. The shape was too symmetrical, too deliberate, with what appeared to be regular, evenly spaced ridges running along its length, almost like ribs. Daniel hovered the drone in place, adjusting the zoom, trying to convince himself he was looking at nothing more than a collapsed fence panel or a piece of farm equipment that had been carried off by the current. That's when the wind shifted, clearing away a low patch of mist that had been drifting off the water, and the object came into full view. It was long, easily the length of a car, and partially buried in the silt, with only its upper portion exposed above the mud. The pale ridges he'd noticed were unmistakably part of a rib-like structure, curved and layered, far too large and far too organized to belong to any animal common to that part of the river. Near one end, a rounded mass sat half-submerged, and though the drone's camera couldn't make out fine detail from that altitude, the general proportions were enough to send a cold, uneasy feeling through Daniel's chest. He brought the drone down another 20 feet, hands tightening on the controller, and that's when the shape in the mud seemed to shift. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of sudden movement that would make you gasp out loud. It was slow, almost imperceptible, the way a heavy branch settles when the water beneath it finally gives way. But Daniel was certain the pale structure had rotated slightly, as though something beneath the surface of the mud had adjusted its position. He pulled the drone back on instinct, gaining altitude fast, and watched the object through the live feed as the ripples in the water around it slowly settled back to stillness. He didn't fly closer again that day. Instead, he brought the drone home, still shaking slightly, and spent the rest of the evening replaying the footage frame by frame, trying to explain away what he'd seen. Driftwood shifting under its own weight was the most reasonable answer, and for a while, he almost believed it. Rivers move things constantly, especially after flooding, and half-buried logs can look uncannily like bones or ribs when the light and mud line up just right. But the movement bothered him. Driftwood doesn't rotate on its own without a strong current pushing it, and the water in that particular bend had been slow and shallow that day. The next morning, Daniel returned to the same stretch of river with a friend, partly for a second opinion, and partly because he didn't want to be alone if the shape turned out to be something he genuinely couldn't explain. They launched the drone from the same spot and flew the same route, and when they reached the bend, the object was gone. Not moved. Not shifted downstream. Simply gone, with only a shallow depression left in the mud where it had been, already filling in with water and debris from the current. They searched the bank on foot for almost an hour, walking the shoreline in both directions, checking beneath overhanging brush and behind fallen trees, but found nothing that matched what the drone had captured the day before. No bones. No driftwood shaped anything like what they'd seen. No sign that anything had ever been there at all, aside from the impression in the mud itself, which any number of things could have caused. Daniel posted the footage online days later, hoping someone with more expertise could identify what he'd captured. The responses were mixed. Some viewers were confident it was nothing more than a large uprooted tree trunk, its root system creating the illusion of rib-like ridges, with the apparent movement explained by settling silt or a passing current disturbing the frame just enough to create the impression of motion. Others weren't so sure, pointing to the proportions of the object and the way it seemed to sit higher out of the mud on one side, as though it had weight and structure that simple driftwood wouldn't have. A few viewers, only half joking, suggested it might have been the carcass of some large animal, perhaps a deer or a livestock swept downstream during the flooding, its body partially decomposed and reshaped by the water into something that only resembled bone from a distance. No official investigation ever followed. There was no missing person, no reported animal carcass, nothing concrete enough to justify sending anyone out to the river bank to search further. The object, whatever it had been, was simply gone by the time anyone with the authority to look into it arrived, and rivers have a way of erasing evidence faster than almost any other environment on land.
Mud shifts.
Water rises and falls. Whatever had been resting in that bend was likely carried further downstream within days, if it hadn't already been buried entirely beneath fresh silt from the next rainfall. Daniel still flies drones along that river today, though he admits he approaches that particular bend differently now. He flies higher over it, keeps his hand ready on the controls and doesn't linger the way he used to when framing a shot. He knows, rationally, that the most likely explanation is the least exciting one, a strange trick of light, mud, and driftwood that his mind filled in with details that weren't really there. But he also knows what he saw on that screen, the slow shift of something pale beneath the surface, and no amount of rational explanation has fully convinced him that the river gave up everything it was hiding that day. That's the strange thing about drones. They were built to show us the world from a distance we could never reach on our own, but sometimes what they show us isn't a wider view of something familiar. It's a small, unexplainable piece of something we were never meant to see up close. The river keeps flowing, the mud keeps shifting, and somewhere along that bank, whatever Daniel's drone found that day is probably still out there, waiting for the next quiet afternoon and the next unsuspecting pilot to fly a little too low. If you enjoyed this collection of unsettling drone discoveries, let us know in the comments which one unsettled you the most, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.